I don't know if there's a second round or not, but there is. Okay? Okay, thank you.
Colleagues, thank you for your attendance. For most of my colleagues, it's kind of like Groundhog Day. We've seen you again. I didn't think we'd see each other this soon, but welcome back. Welcome, Mr. Graham. Welcome, Mr. Ayub. Welcome, Mr. Grewal. Good to see you back at the table again. And welcome, Minister. Minister, I know that we've only got an hour, so I will, without further ado, turn it over to you, and perhaps you can brief our colleagues around this table as to the purpose of your visit and get right into your presentation.
Thanks, thanks, Mr. Chair. And this morning, this is actually my 12th committee appearance between either a Senate or House parliamentary committee since the swearing in of the new government last November. I'm delighted to be here. J'ai le plaisir d'être accompagné.
I'm pleased to have with me Yaprak Baltasioglu, the Secretary of the Treasury Board, and Brian Pagan, the Assistant Secretary of the Expenditure Management Sector for my department. Marcia Santiago is also here from the Treasury Board, and Joyce Murray, Parliamentary Secretary for our department.
To be here again is great. This, since we last met, there has been significant progress made, as evidenced in the paper provided to you. This committee has played an important role in budget and estimates reform for some time, going back to 2012, the report strengthening parliamentary scrutiny of estimates and supply, which provided very thoughtful analysis and recommendations which have helped serve as a roadmap on estimates reform. In fact, a number of the steps already taken were in response to that report and its recommendations. These included the creation of a searchable online database known as InfoBase, which has been recognized by the PBO as the authoritative source of government expenditure information. A pilot project with Transport Canada to test a new program-based vote structure, the identification in estimates documents of all new funding according to the associated budget document to make it easier for parliamentarians to follow that. We continue to move forward with this agenda, most notably on the question of budget and estimates timing and alignment, and I want to speak with you briefly on that this morning. The ability to exercise oversight over government spending is the most important role that we as parliamentarians can play in representing Canadians. Toutefois, le processus actuel.
The current process makes it difficult for members of Parliament to carry out that function. As a long-standing member of Parliament, I was also limited by various features of the estimates process.
Colleagues, some of you who were there, I noted that this spring I will have been in June 2nd, it'll be 20 years for me as a member of Parliament. By that time, it will have been 3.5 years in a government and 16.5 in opposition. So my perspective on some of these things is not simply shaped as a member of a government, but as a member of Parliament. And it's one of the reasons why I'm excited to discuss with you the government's vision for estimates reform. Change in this area is not easy. In fact, Robert Marlowe, former clerk of the House, has noted that the form and content of the main estimates has only been modified on 4 occasions since Confederation, most recently in 1997. Clearly, there's a lot of work to be done, and in terms of strengthening the ability for Parliament to hold government to account. I firmly believe that the vision we're proposing will help address the many issues raised over the ineffectiveness of the estimates process in Canada. This includes concerns of the Auditor General, who underlined the importance of better timing between the budget and estimates. Our vision includes 4 areas that are currently the source for a lot of frustration for parliamentarians. To make things manageable and to achieve early progress, I would propose that we focus our attention on the first area right away. It deals with the timing of the main estimates in the budget and would require a simple change to the standing orders. Once this important reform is implemented, we could take the necessary time to study and consider the other areas. I'd like to go through each area with the committee. As I said, the first is in the area of timing of the main estimates and budget. Currently, the main estimates for the upcoming year need to be tabled in Parliament by March 1st. In practice, this means that the main estimates can only reflect Treasury Board decisions as of January, roughly, well before the budget actually comes out. This timing affects parliamentarians because the main estimates, which MPs are meant to scrutinize and to vote on, end up not reflecting the government's plans and priorities as outlined in the budget for the same year. The other thing is that all the work that goes into Parliament's scrutiny of the main estimates is rendered basically irrelevant when the budget comes out. And wasting Parliament's time doing irrelevant work is not my idea of a priority. We need to fix that and make sure Parliament is engaged in meaningful work, including holding governments to account. Therefore, we propose that the main estimates be tabled by May 1st instead of by March 1st, that the main estimates can include budget items. Le deuxième défi à relever.
The second challenge is the differences in scope and accounting methods between the budget and the estimates.
Concepts. The budget represents the entire universe of federal spending. This includes consolidated accounts such as EI and tax expenditures such as the new Canada Child Benefit. The estimates, meanwhile, support the more limited appropriation requirements of departments and agencies. Nonetheless, parliamentarians need to be able to compare items in the budget and the estimates. The government will build on recent efforts to improve accrual planning in departments and reconciliation to cash appropriations in the estimates. And there's been some work done on that in terms of reconciliation between accrual and cash accounting, and we want to deepen that and expand it. Le troisième point concerne le fait que
the third area is the difficulty members of Parliament have in connecting the money we vote for with the program it will be used for.
Authority from Parliament on the basis of votes in the Appropriation Acts. These describe how funds are spent on items such as capital, operating, and grants and contributions. We'd like to focus more on why we're spending and strengthen the link between the votes and the actual specific programs they fund. Finalement, beaucoup de rapports ministériels.
Lastly, many departmental reports are neither meaningful nor informative.
Government has a lot of people writing reports that aren't that useful in terms of the quality of information and that not a whole lot of people read. So in the same way I said I don't think it's a good idea to waste parliamentarians' time unnecessarily. I think we're wasting a lot of good public servants' time writing reports that people aren't using because they're not formatted in a way that they're useful. Our new Treasury Board policy on results will simplify how government reports on the resources it uses and on the results it achieves. Reports will now tell people what departments do and what they're trying to achieve and how they measure success, with an increased focus on metrics and measuring results and delivery, so that ministers, Parliament, and ultimately Canadians can hold government to account and have an understanding of the effectiveness of programs. In addition, detailed information on program spending and the number of FTEs or people working will be provided in a user-friendly online database. Monsieur le Président, ce sont les grands...
Mr. Chair, these are the broad outlines of our vision for fundamentally changing the estimates process so that members of Parliament are better able to hold the government to account.
Forward to the committee's engagement in driving the reform of estimates to benefit all of parliamentarians. And I look forward to engaging in the short term on the alignment of budget and estimates timing. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn it over to Brian, who will go through a more detailed presentation of the proposed reforms.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Pagan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the President just said, today's presentation aims to explain the government's vision for reforming the main estimates and how to better help parliamentarians by providing them with the best information possible when comes the time to scrutinize government expenditures.
Quite quickly, to go through the 4 pillars as presented by the estimates. Present Pillar 1, the question of timing, and then perhaps pause for questions around that crucial element of timing. As we see here in the outline, the proposed approach of 4 pillars builds on recommendations from this committee, the 2012 study of OGO on the estimates process, as well as our initial briefing with this very committee on the 1st of February, or in February last year, where we laid out the challenges around timing. We believe that once we have the timing properly sequenced, we will be able to move forward with a better understanding of needs and requirements around scope and accounting, the vote structure of appropriations, and results and reporting.
It's clear that the estimates are essential for the good functioning of government. This is part of parliamentary oversight, and the estimates reflect government priorities in terms of expenditures and helps to produce reports on spending and results. Yet, often members of Parliament have said that they cannot fulfill their role of oversight in order to shed a close look on expenditures, and the budget process has become inconsistent because there is no alignment. It's very difficult to understand these expenditure reports, and many reports are not relevant or illuminating.
The government sets out a 4-pillar approach to fundamental change, beginning with the first step of changing the timing of main estimates. And as the President mentioned, taking this step will present a more coherent document and allow for the inclusion of budget estimates. Par la suite, on peut mieux facilement.
If we do that, it will be easier to reconcile different accounting methods, accrual and cash accounting, better supervise votes, and we are going to ensure that reports are more clear so that MPs better understand how money is spent, results expected and obtained. I will now describe each of these pillars more in detail.
The issue of estimates timing is very critical to any comprehension of the government's aspirations related to the budget and Parliament's understanding and control of departmental expenditures. According to existing standing orders, Section 84(1) of the standing orders, the government must table on or before the 1st of March main estimates for the year. In reality, to be able to do this by the 1st of March, we need to prepare a document that reflects Treasury Board decisions up until the end of January. Now, we know that in a typical year, the government will table its budget somewhere between mid-February and mid-March. So evidently, locking down the main estimates by the end of January precludes any ability to reflect budget items in the main estimates. As the President has mentioned, this presents the scenario where we are presenting to Parliament the certainty of program expenditures that do not reflect the new plans of government, the new priorities of government as they are articulated in the budget that's tabled in February and March. So this in itself presents a fundamental challenge and incoherence in terms of understanding the budget and estimates process. To remedy this, the government is proposing that the main estimates be tabled on or before the 1st of May instead of on or before the 1st of March. At this point, the budget would have been presented and we would have an opportunity to include budget items in the estimates for Parliament's scrutiny. This change would include a number of benefits, not the least of which is a more coherent sequencing of the documents, a timelier implementation of budget initiatives, the ability to reconcile the estimates back to the budget that was tabled in February or March, and the possibility of eliminating a supplementary exercise. Currently, we have the main estimates and 3 supplementary estimates. We would be simplifying the process and presenting fewer documents to Parliament and therefore less confusion. I would emphasize that in terms of beginning the fiscal year and the approval of interim supply, nothing would change. We would, as was clear in the document, we would present an interim estimates and an interim supply bill that would be based on a continuation of the current year existing authorities that would allow departments to begin the year and then introduce full supply in June according to the current supply calendar. Before pausing for questions on the issue of timing, I would just present this in a visual form where we see the period now, October, November, the government preparing its fiscal and economic update. That becomes the basis for planning the budget. We understand that the government would be intending to present a budget to Parliament in the February-March timeframe. We would introduce interim supply for the 1st of March, allowing departments to begin the fiscal year in April with authorities. And then we would follow up with a main estimates that reflects budget priorities and a reconciliation to the budget in May for Parliament's consideration of full supply in June. Mr. President, at this time I think it might be appropriate to pause and allow committee members to digest this issue of timing and perhaps take questions on this very critical step.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pagan, and thank you, Minister, for your presentation. Before we turn it over to questions and answers, perhaps you'll permit me to make an observation or two. Outside of yourself, I haven't been in Parliament as long as you, Minister, but I believe that outside of yourself, I'm the longest serving parliamentarian at this table, and I agree with your assessment that the budgetary process in terms of parliamentary oversight has been, in my view at least, and I've been saying this for well over 12 years, almost a bit of a joke. We simply didn't have the ability to delve into the numbers effectively and to give the scrutiny that we have been charged with doing. So I applaud you in your efforts of trying to simplify this and to trying to streamline the process so that all parliamentarians at least have an opportunity to observe and make comment on literally a multi-billion-dollar functioning of Parliament. So I applaud you on that. My question for you is this, however. In the last Parliament, I was charged with the review of the standing orders. And as you know, each year a new Parliament sits. There is a finite period of time for standing orders to be reviewed. Matter of fact, there was a debate in Parliament just a week or so ago when we were on the road. The approach I took with the all-party committees studying changes to the standing orders, and we made a few minor ones, was that I suggested we needed unanimity to make sure, since standing orders are really the backbone of what we do and how we operate in this institution. Have you, Minister, considered standing order changes requiring unanimous consent, or exactly how did you plan to approach that?
Well, there's a couple. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, the change to the standing orders required for this would be moving the deadline for the main estimates from March 1st to May 1st. This committee has the ability to, as a committee, recommend to Parliament a change. We will work with members of Parliament from all parties on this. The timing of it, really, in order to have this change apply to the next budget and estimates and main estimates and budget, would require something basically sometime in November, and I think what I would hate to see is us lose a year in terms of this significant improvement. We have the ability. I view a lot of this, any change like this, as part of an evergreening approach. We as Parliament should always look at ways we can strengthen parliamentary governance, or good governance broadly, and on an ongoing basis. So in other words, a change that we make now in terms of the standing orders, the next budget estimates process will see a more logical sequencing of the budget and estimates, with the main estimates actually reflecting what's in the budget. And then as time goes on, I look at the Australia model, for instance, where the budget and main estimates appear almost at the same time, or even in Ontario where it's about 12 days after. As the departments become accustomed to this new timing and sequencing, there will be a tightening of budget and estimates timing over time that will operationalize as a result of greater efficiency. So I view this as the start, and that over time you'll see a tightening of budget estimates timing so that they're more coincident.
Thank you. And I apologize to the committee for taking up some of your valuable time, but we'll start with a 7-minute round of questioning. Madame Ratanzi.
Thank you, Chair, and it's your privilege to ask the question anyway. So, Minister, thank you, and thank you for taking the initiative. I've been in Parliament from 2004 to 11, and I understand, even as a financial person and as an accountant, it was really difficult to bring coherence and transparency. So, in terms of the alignment between the estimate and the budget, what sort of cooperation will you need? Because the estimates are prepared by Treasury Board and the budget by Finance. So what sort of collaboration currently exists, and what would you like to see going forward?
Well, there's a great level of collaboration between Treasury Board and Finance. I think in recent years there's been an increased collaboration, in fact resulting in last year, in terms of items in the budget, 70% were in the subs A, as an example. In terms of cash and accrual accounting, we are already doing more reconciliation in terms of tables to reconcile the cash and accrual accountings, such that parliamentarians can easily reconcile the two. There are advantages to both systems. The Australians found that in moving to accrual there were some challenges. I think you've actually engaged some of the Australians.
Yes, we did.
At this committee. So what we want to do is more reconciliation, and over time we are open to this committee's recommendation on movement towards accrual. But again, there are advantages to both, and having reconciliation.
But you haven't faced challenges in collaboration. You have been working as a department very well, and alignment of the budget to the main estimates really makes coherence. It is a strategy that is really important. So in your 4 pillars that you've presented, which one of the first would you like to approve? Is it a step-by-step process, or is it one-shot deal?
Well, they're all really important, and I'm enthusiastic about all of them. The one that requires a change to the standing orders is that of the first one, the budget and estimates timing. And again, over time, I mean, we have the May 1st date, which provides flexibility in the first budget cycle, first couple budget cycles. As departments, when you're changing these kinds of things, these are big departments. Government itself is a large, complex organization, or group of organizations. these are significant changes. So initially, it will take some time. It will take a couple budget cycles to get towards the full potential of this. But the objective, and I want to see a close alignment and a tightening of budget and main estimates timing.
Fair enough?
Brett.
Sorry, yes.
Just to add a little bit on what Minister said, out of the 4 pillars, the results policy, like making sure that departmental results and plans are meaningful to parliamentarians and also for government itself, that policy has been approved by Treasury Board. We're rolling it out. The first results, better results documents will come this fall, and hopefully all of the departments by next fall. Accrual and cash, more work needs to be done by us, but every year we're getting better at making sure that that's reflected. So all of the 4 pillars, the first one is the one that requires Parliament's approval. The other ones, I think that we can, with the committee's concurrence, we can just proceed and make the progress.
My second question is what the chair asked, what you need unanimous consent to move from, for the standing orders. Do you see any challenges? You're out there educating the public, not the public, but the parliamentarians. Do you find that there'll be any challenges or understanding gaps that they may have?
Well, thanks, Yasmin. And the chair, Tom, has been involved in government in terms of procedural issues and how there's different ways you can accomplish this. It's my strong view that what we're doing, everything we're doing, is strengthening Parliament's ability to hold governments to account. Not just our government, but future governments. Are there changes in the future that we can do as we operationalize these changes? I believe there are, and we can consider those in the future. But I think it would be a mistake to let perfection be the enemy of the good.
No problem.
When we actually have the capacity to get
So my next question is quite interesting. In UK, the Treasury function and the financial function is in one minister. Not that I want you out of your job or anything, but
I thought you were talking about Minister Morneau.
No. So, what would be the challenges in a place like Canada? Would that function work? Would it make anything better? Because we've been hearing so many things, and if you can give a quick.
Look, in Canada, the Treasury Board role is not just in terms of government spending, but also a challenge function on operational effectiveness across department and agency, not just in terms of financial results, but the results, are the results consistent with those intended by the government, particularly in a new results and delivery framework, which is a priority of the government. But the other thing is in terms of regulatory, we have a role in terms of scrutinizing and approving regulatory changes, which is becoming more prominent now with the Regulatory Cooperation Council with the Americans. But I think back to so our system itself and Treasury Board is the only permanent committee of cabinet going back to Confederation. It works really, really well, and there is a good relationship with Finance, and Finance has been a good partner working with us even through these changes. There's a good collaborative relationship. Thanks, Yasmin.
Okay, 7 minutes.
I think we can all agree that aligning the estimates and the budget process is a very good thing. Big question for you. The 2002 OGO report suggested March 31st. You're saying May 1st.
Yeah. Well, in terms of,
rather.
and I think in time, as you go through a couple of budget cycles, we can operationalize this and strengthen and narrow that significantly.
What's the thinking behind May 1st, though, instead of what OGO said in 2012?
Flexibility initially as we operationalize this, because it will take a significant change in terms of the working of departments to do this. I want to see in time that we can have the main estimates by April 1st. I want to see that. But I also want to ensure that as we move towards that,
Right.
that departments are able to respond in time.
Do you think something's changed since a couple of years ago that, or was the OGO 2012 version just incorrect, or they hadn't thought it through, or?
No, I think the OGO report was actually very instructive.
Because one of the issues we have about May 1st, of course, is we have to have by May 1 the two suggested departments for committee as a whole, so we lose out on that. And the whole purpose is, expanded transparency, and we're losing a lot of time to be able to review before our June cutoff.
So
I understand the need, but we seem to be going step forward, step backwards.
So here's, it's May 1st, what we're proposing, and that is to provide a flexibility in terms of government being able to actually ensure the first couple budget cycles were fine. I actually think we can do it earlier, and I think that if we have, we should be able to be, I would hope we can deliver main estimates by April 1st. So the ability for government to do that is, or the priority for government to do that is one that I take seriously. But this is to provide some flexibility in the first couple budget cycles as we move towards a narrowing of budget estimates timing. Again, Australia I hold as a model in terms of having the budget and estimates almost coincident, and that's the gold standard. Yeah, Prak?
It's, the reason why we're suggesting latest by May 1st is to give that flexibility. If you apply it practically to this year, for example, we almost have to...
How do you address the concerns, though, of, again, we introduced, and by the way, the same day, opposition give us your two departments for committee as a whole, and how do you address, and I understand flexibility, but how do you address our concerns about a shortened period of time for us to review costs? Again, it's going back to Westminster. That was the reason of Parliament put together, was review spending.
We totally agree with you, but right now, currently, Parliament really doesn't get the real accounts, and it gets it in many, many pieces. And for departments, for departmental managers, an expenditure can show up in the budget and may not get authority for 18 months. So we're trying to find a sweet spot where we can actually implement this. And hopefully, as the minister said, ideally, it should be no later than April 1st.
No, I think we agree with the 2012 OGO report, and I think I understand, but I think we probably can get it done by then. Have we looked at a fixed budget date to move up the budget to, say, February? Look at, the Australians do a phenomenal job. I don't think they have it legislated, but it is their tradition. I think it's the second Monday of May going back.
We have that talk there.
And we hear, well, there's issues of minority governments, this and that. But in Canada, both Liberal and Conservative governments, minority or not, every year since going back 17, have done it within a couple-week period, except for 1 year.
Yeah, well,
could we not just move?
In terms of the timing of the estimates is in the standing orders. The timing of the budget is the purview of finance. If you look
but you get along well with finance, so you can work. You get along so well with finance, you can.
We have, but if you look at over the years, there have been times post 9/11, different times when in fact finance saw fit appropriately to bring in a budget or a significant economic statement that contained a lot of budgetary measures. What we're proposing today, in fact, and I'm going to ask Brian to speak to budget tabling dates from 2006 to 2016 to give some perspective.
We're short on time, so
yeah.
Fast.
What we are proposing will significantly improve the sequencing and alignment. It is what I can, as Treasury Board President, these four have required a significant level of engagement with finance and across government. They are a significant step forward. I think the sequencing one is very important in terms of changing the standing orders. But I don't view this as the last thing, Kelly. I think that this is a first significant step, but that we can do more. If we have a moment, Brian can speak to the last 10 years.
Well, no, and I agree, but I think, moving up the estimates, but also considering fixed date for budget, because we seem to be accomplishing it anyways, except for 2006.
Was the 2012 OGO report, I'm not certain if it addressed fixed budget date. There was some reference to it. This is something in the same way that this committee has had an influence on the work we're doing now, it will continue to have an influence on it. And the other thing going forward is we will be able to, on an iterative level, evaluate how things are going and how we can improve things. So this is a partnership.
Just, Mr. Pagan, before you go, I think just because we're running out of time, I think we will have to eventually decide again about some of the issues if it is May 1, shortening our ability to review and scrutinize, but also again, some of the issues again, May 1 being the cutoff for our ability to call or to name the two departments.
Mr. Bacon will have to wait until perhaps the next intervention. We'll have to go to Mr. Weir now for 7 minutes.
Thanks. So we've had a discussion about May 1st versus April 1st as deadlines for the estimates. The other side of the sequencing question is when the budget happens. So I do want to pick up on this matter of a fixed budget date. We're kind of assuming that the federal government usually tables a budget in February and March, but of course there's no requirement for that. There was even a year, I believe 2002, where the federal government didn't put forward a budget. So I wonder why, in trying to fix this timing question, Mr. Minister, you're not proposing either a fixed budget date or a set range of dates for the budget.
Thank you, Aaron. And again, what we're proposing today is a significant improvement in terms of sequencing of budget and estimates. This is something that will be a major improvement. Currently, the budget is exclusively the purview of the Minister of Finance, whereas the estimates, it is subject to the standing orders. So changing the dates of the standing orders to better enable sequencing, logical sequencing with the budget is something that as Treasurer Board President I can propose, and it's in my purview to do that in conjunction with Parliament. This will be a significant improvement over that which exists now in terms of the practice. But the practical, in reality, as you said, there is a custom in terms of budget introduction. Brian can, if I may, Brian has, in fact, budget tabling dates from 2006 to 2016 to put it in some perspective.
Right. Thank you, Minister. As the Minister said, we absolutely are working very closely with Finance to lessen the time or shorten the gap between the tabling of the budget and presentation of the main estimates. The fact remains, however, that there are instances where the Department of Finance needs some flexibility in terms of the timing of the budget. In the fall of 2008, there was a global economic recession, and so the government of the day worked very hard to bring forward a budget quite quickly in the cycle to provide assurances to markets and to Canadians.
Yes, that would be fair enough where there was a need to present the budget early, but I suppose why not present a deadline for the budget in the same way we're suggesting a deadline for the estimates?
Right. As the Minister said, the issue, what we have tried to do is reflect the spirit of the 2012 report from OGO, where they requested a specific fixed budget date. The reality is there is nothing in the standing orders, there's nothing in the Financial Administration Act or our Constitution about budgets, and therefore we are not in a position to specify what that tabling date is, because as you
okay,
said,
but Mr. Minister, would your recommendation to the Minister of Finance be that there should be a fixed budget date, a set range of dates for the budget, a deadline by which a budget must be presented every year?
I think, first of all, we are going to accomplish through the changes we're proposing here today a better alignment of the budget and estimates process. That doesn't obviate the need to continue to consider improvements, including potentially in the future an earlier deadline on estimates, and a discussion. We're open to discussions, and if this committee, as we go through this change, as we evaluate the impact of these changes, that's something that I would be interested in the input of the committee. But what I would, again, perfection being the enemy of the good, I'd like to proceed with an improvement that makes a significant change in terms of accountability to Parliament and Parliament's ability to scrutinize.
Just perhaps
the estimates Parliament scrutinizes right now, you spend a lot of time on those, and to a large extent, your time is wasted because we come up with the budget shortly after, and a lot of that work, a lot of that analysis is wasted. It's rendered irrelevant. What we want to do is make sure the work of parliamentarians is meaningful and impactful and holds government to account on the things that really matter.
Right, and in terms of that work, I do want to congratulate you, Mr. Minister, on your keen ability to have moved between the Liberal and Conservative parties to remain on the opposition benches for a maximum amount of time. So you clearly do appreciate the importance of effective opposition.
Progressive Conservative, progressive.
Indeed.
We wanted to make that point as well.
Well, thanks. I'm happy to facilitate that point. What I did want to ask, though,
I was actually born as a Liberal. I just came out in 2003.
All right. So you mentioned that these reforms might ultimately remove the need for supplementary estimates. And while we certainly would value a more streamlined process, part of the importance of supplementary estimates is they provide an opportunity for scrutiny by the opposition, to have ministers such as yourself before this committee. So I wonder, in potentially eliminating supplementary estimates, what would be the replacement to ensure adequate opportunities over the course of the year for parliamentarians to scrutinize the budget?
Couple things. I think that over time, the degree to which budget initiatives can be incorporated into main estimates will reduce the reliance on supplementary estimates. I don't see them being eliminated. I see our reliance on them being reduced over time. But last year, right now, subs A are actually more important in some ways than the main estimates. So last year, 70% of the budget initiatives were delivered in subs A. So in some ways, you could argue that subs A was more pertinent than the main estimates. The big thing is around here, and I'm saying broadly, Parliament, there are people who've been here a long time as members of Parliament who don't really understand the estimate and budget processes. And it's not really their fault, because if you were to design intentionally a system and the objective was to design a system that was hard to understand, you would not do better than the one we have right now. But nobody wants to put their hand up and say, I don't understand this. We believe making it, this is one of the few changes, Aaron, that sometimes when you're doing something, it's hard to explain what it will look like after.
Sure.
But this is actually easier to explain how the system will work after the change than it is what the system is now. I can't explain
in terms of how it would look.
We're out of time, but
I'm sorry.
I will point out both to Mr. Weir and to Mr. McCauley with your questioning about a fixed budget date. In the 2012 OGO report, there was a recommendation that the budget be presented no later than February 1. Certainly would be within the purview of this committee to make such a recommendation again, should we wish. Mr. Whalen, you're up for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you guys for coming. As a new MP, it's interesting to see how the department's thinking on these 4 pillars of realigning the budget and the estimates process has evolved over the course of the last year. One of the first things we received when we came in December or November, whenever you were called last year, was a big stack of documents on estimates B and C, which were almost indecipherable, and then over time we learned how to figure them out, and now we're talking about changing them. Just to follow up a little bit on Mr. Weir's question, do you see estimates A sort of being combined into the mains and then only having estimates A and B and no need for a C, or only in very, very rare circumstances? or we still see all three extra sets of estimates in addition to interim supply, in addition to the mains?
I'm going to start, and then I'll get Brian to opine because he's got more institutional memory on this from Treasury Board's perspective. I see that the reliance on subs A and B, as an example, will be less than they are right now. As you sequence the main estimates after the budget, the main estimates, I think, will take on a more important role as they ought to. But this will take time. Again, some of the changes to operationalize within government will take a couple budget cycles to get it closer to the full potential. At least, a couple. Brian, would you like to?
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Whalen, for the question. And just to be clear, what we are proposing with this vision is not to eliminate supplementary estimates. It's to render the process more coherent and sequential so that the main estimates tabled after the budget, in fact, reflect budget priorities. And so in that scenario, as we mentioned last year, we brought forward approximately 70% of the budget in supplementary estimates A. We would replace that spring supplementary estimates with the main estimates that would have the budget initiatives. And then we would bring forward the remaining budget priorities in a fall supplementary estimate, which would become the first SUPS of the year, SUPS A in the fall, and then a cleanup of accounts in the winter in SUPS B. So we would continue to have an estimates document in each supply period, which would encourage committees to continue to call on departments and continue their scrutiny of government expenditure plans. I would also mention, just in terms of history, that we introduced the spring SUPS in 2007 as a way of facilitating a more timely implementation of budget initiatives. That has proven to be helpful, as we saw last year, but we can make the process more efficient by simply presenting a better main estimates, and that's the heart of the proposal.
In the concern over whether or not there's a need for a fixed budget date to have this process aligned, what do you envision would happen if, the first week of April rolls around, a government in the future is not ready to present its budget? Would the department then be forced to carry two sets of main estimates it's working on, one which reflects the old process and one which reflects a new process? And how difficult and taxing would that be on the department to try to triage a situation like that?
Right. Thank you again for the question. In fact, what we have seen over the last 10 years is a wide variation in terms of budget tabling. We've seen something as early as January in 2009 in response to the global economic crisis, and then as recently as 2015 when we had a different problem in the energy market and a precipitous drop in energy prices, which had all kinds of impacts and implications for the government's ability to forecast and project requirements. We saw a budget in April that year, April 21st. And so because we do not have a fixed budget date, because the government will want to avail itself of the flexibility to take advantage of the best available information in setting its economic forecasts, a tabling date of the 1st of May would encompass anything we've seen over the last 10 years, and should it provide the government with the ability to, at the very least, table the estimates after the budget so that we can reconcile to the budget.
Mr. Bryson, we look at the different pillars. It seems that the department is very close now on Pillar 1. It seems some of the changes that are being proposed also include certain aspects of Pillar 4, which is departmental reports and plans and priorities. Can you speak a little bit about how ready you feel the department is in implementing the changes of having those plans and priorities presented in a more coherent fashion on May 1st of next year or sooner, sure, along with the main estimates?
Well, we're actually Treasury Board policy in terms of departmental reports as part of a broader results and delivery approach for our government. We're already doing that, and we're moving towards that. We have, even in terms of the format of Treasury Board submissions, the degree to which departments and agencies, as they present submissions to Treasury Board, we are pushing and getting metrics and a commitment to a results and delivery model so that we understand what the not just committing funds, but actually establishing objectives or goals in terms of what they're going to accomplish. So that part of it we are doing at Treasury Board as a central agency already. Some of the other areas in terms of we're doing more reconciliation between cash and accrual accounting as part of what we're doing already. And in terms of program-based expenditure reportage, we've done that with Transport Canada, and we're going to be doing more.
Sorry, Mr. Bryson, I have a very short question.
Yes.
We haven't seen a copy of any proposed text for what the new standing order would look like. And so has the department advanced its thinking that far to what the standing order would look like? And, it was in the report?
Well, it would be the involving of the change in the date. I don't want to assume, the committee will.
Minister, perhaps if I could interject, having some knowledge in this, Mr. Whalen, our committee could certainly propose the text.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Final two interventions before the minister has to leave. 5-minute interventions each. Mr. Clark, you're up for 5.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. I don't want to.
Your office is not here, so.
Minister?
I think we'll stay a little.
All right. Well, we'll try and complete an entire round of questioning. Thank you for that, Minister. Monsieur Clark, 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Minister, thank you for your very candid approach. We're very pleased that you can stay a bit longer, and thank you for bringing your staff with you today as well. Now, this reform for Her Majesty's loyal opposition is quite interesting, and we want these reforms to be done for the benefit of all Canadians. So we're taking this very seriously, but we still have some serious questions. First, we believe it makes sense to make this entire process much more consistent, to make the study, the oversight by Canadians and parliamentarians easier. I would like to follow up with what my colleague Mr. McCauley was saying. You seem to indicate that we need a period of adjustment. We believe that the Australian model is quite interesting. So to have on the same day the budget and the main estimates. Your colleague from the department was saying that certain adjustments would have to be made and there would have to be some flexibility. Can you tell us a little more about these adjustments? What exactly would they be if we need to be flexible for a couple of years? Thank you very much. I appreciate the question, Mr. Clark. Clearly, when there is a fundamental change in departmental operations, it takes time for the departments to work together to bring about those changes. At the same time, it's an objective for myself to end up with a process whereby the budgets and the estimates will be presented at the same time. For me, Australia is the right model to follow, and I've said that from the start. But nevertheless, it takes time to bring about those changes. It might take 2 years just to allow the departments to acclimatize to these changes. But I agree with you on the idea of better aligning these two processes. Thank you, Mr. Minister. But what we are concerned about as the official opposition is that the time given to MPs for oversight, that time not be reduced. And I do understand that you want flexibility to bring about those adjustments. You've talked about an adjustment period of 2 to 3 years. But don't you think it would be a good idea to include a provision in the Act which sets out that within 2 or 3 years we will table the estimates and the budget on the same day? Is that a potential idea you would be willing to look at? Well, it's always the prerogative of this committee and of Parliament to consider changes to the standing orders. We would be willing to include any improvements, and I am open to constantly improving. In English, it's called evergreening. If we are to bring about the changes as they are being described today, if we decide to go ahead, after a couple of months, maybe after a couple of years, maybe after 2 years or so, after 2 budget cycles, we will better understand the changes and any potential changes which could come after that. That's an important stage we must go through, but I'm completely open to any other changes which might come in the future. Thank you, Mr. Minister.
Sir.
Thank you. Minister, I want to build on something you said at the beginning of your comments, and that was alluded to rather explicitly by Mr. Weir, in that you have the most experience of any government caucus member in opposition, and that you have, therefore, a tremendous amount of experience in reading the main estimates and the SUPs. I remember as a staffer going to your office and getting translation from your staff of the estimates to plain English, as I found them dissected rather on every horizontal and vertical surface of your office. But my question to you is, with that experience in that role, in concrete terms, how would this have changed your life if this had been the case over the last 10 years?
Well, we had to work awfully hard in opposition, and I had a tremendous, who still works with me, Tisha Ashton, works with me.
Who I was alluding to.
And she, in terms of budget estimates work, there's a handful of us over the years who have spent a lot of time on this. It is, you shouldn't have to work that hard as a member of Parliament or as a staff person, a member of Parliament, simply to understand what is fundamental to your job, and that is, the government spending, to be able to hold the government to account. It was asinine, it is asinine, that so much of this work goes into translating from government documents and processes into understandable formats, that which we need to scrutinize. So it didn't make sense for me in opposition. It does make sense for me in government. To the credit of Treasury Board, I can say as well that there had been a lot of good work done in Treasury Board in the past. In fact, I spoke to Tony Clement last week about some of this, and he told me that at that time, he was aware of some of this work and understood the importance of it. This has been percolating within the public service for some time, and I just happen to feel very strongly about it, having spent so much time, and as a member of Parliament, you don't want to admit you don't understand this. There are ministers in any cabinet who don't have a lot of parliamentary experience, who don't have this. There are people who've been around Parliament for a long time. There's like this is not a system as it is now designed to be understood, and we want to change that.
Well, there are people who don't do their own taxes who have to understand this stuff. So.
Pardon me?
There are people who don't do their own taxes who have to understand this stuff. So. In the same vein, are there other subtle improvements around the edges that you'd want to see as well that we have not addressed? That in the same vein.
I mean, I really want to get some of these changes done and move forward. The part that we've spent a lot of time on this is the departmental reports. This morning we're not talking much about the departmental reports. I think that's a big item. I think program-based budgeting, we're members of parliament, we're parliamentarians. I say members of parliament, I'm also talking about senators because there's a lot of expertise in the Senate on budget estimates processes, on the Senate Finance Committee particularly. But there's a lot of this work. I also view that Parliament better engaged, parliamentary committees better engaged, Parliament as a whole better engaged can help contribute to the analysis of budget items and measure the effectiveness of them. There should be some things that we can agree on a nonpartisan basis, and one is measures that will clearly improve the ability of Parliament to do its job.
Okay, thank you. If there's a few seconds left, Mr. Whalen has one quick follow-up question to throw back, if you could. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, David.
Minister Bryson, the approach you're proposing to align the estimates with the budget now, but then to continue to examine the accounting methods, the votes, and the continuous improvement of departmental reports, I feel that it aligns with what our committee has heard. I don't think we've heard enough yet on accounts and votes, accruals, and different cost measures. We've engaged our study, but with respect to this first change, it sounds like it's something the department is able and ready to do. If we were to recommend something, should we be able to, are we ready yet to put a date, like no more than X days after the budget is tabled and no later than May the 1st? Would that be a more helpful formulation, or are we not quite ready for that type of restriction?
Yeah. Again, I'll have a better idea of this, you know, over the next year or so, and that's I'm being candid with you. What we're doing here is quite a fundamental change. We will be pushing to have a closer alignment of the budget and estimates sequentially. The estimates after the main estimates after the budget. We'll have a better idea after the main estimates and budget process of 2017, and I will gladly, this committee invites me anytime, I'll be here. But we will have a better idea, and of course I will be here to defend estimates. One of the things we can talk about in addition to those estimates specifically is this process. We'll have a better idea then, but it does take a while to operationalize these things. And YAPRAC as a...
Unfortunately, we're...
Yeah, just a small explanation and maybe one answer to the question. Why is it going to take us a few years? It's because what's in the budget and what goes into estimates are completely different detail of a program. For estimates, we make sure that the full detail and the design is done. So that is where we need the time. So when budget and estimates come, ideally where we want to be, hopefully in a few years, where the budget makes the commitment and we give the green light to a program to be on the ground the day main estimates are approved. That's what we're aiming for, but it's a little soon for the whole machine to turn that way.
Thank you for the clarification. Minister, we'll perhaps, if we finish this round, it would be about 15 minutes, just a little less, if you can spare the time. We thank you for that. Mr. McCauley, 5 minutes.
Just very quickly on Pillar 1, when it talks about alignment, and again, we're comparing ourselves to Australia, and you're right, they do everything great, although everything that God created that can kill you and crawls is there. It talks about Australia taking a very short period of time between policy and implementation of policy, and of course, we're lagging behind at 9 or 19 months. YAPRAC, maybe give us an idea why it's like that, and then it talks about recent success demonstrates that such an internal alignment as possible with the Government of Canada. Just wondering if you could talk on what you're considering the recent successes.
Just a couple things I'll ask for YAPRAC to opine, because again, Brian and YAPRAC and Marcia and, you know, in our department have seen more of this. I was on Treasury Board Cabinet Committee in the previous government, but it's different being President of Treasury Board. You get to see it from a different perspective. There is a closer alignment now between, in terms of collaboration between Treasury Board and Finance than I think that which has existed in the past. I think it's one of there's a very close collaborative relationship and engagement throughout the budget process, stronger than in the past. So there has been some progress made. As Yaprak said, the details involved in the main estimates are far greater than that in a budget. A budget is sort of gives a general view and a perspective. Like, for instance, you can say we're going to invest so much money into Indigenous education.
Right, but a
but the
19-month
details
lag,
come out.
it's all just the details.
I know, but that's exactly the point, Kelly, is that currently there is up to an 18-month lag. So we're seeking to shorten that dramatically in terms of budget and estimates alignment process to get it closer together. The reason we're asking, you've cited actually a key reason why we're saying May 1st initially, is to provide us, because this is like that old country music song, give me 40 acres and I'll turn this rig around. We're going to need a little time to get this, to work this through. Brad?
I'm not familiar with that song, but maybe at another time.
I'm a country.
I've got one more question, so if you don't mind being brief.
Absolutely, and I can't top the country music song. It is a change of the way that Australians do is that when the budget cycle starts, Treasury and Finance both work at the same time, not only in terms of the policy, but also what could a program look like. Because it starts from the get-go, then they can table it at the same time. That's where we should be. And you know, May 1st may sound like a long way away for designing all of these programs. Basically, we are going to have to go to start from the beginning and design it at the same time. That's what we're aiming to do.
Right. Pillar 3, I just bounce over. Again, we're here about transparency, accountability. One of the suggestions, it seems to be kind of the opposite. It's saying giving higher, give higher votes, but let the departments have more flexibility to use the money without parliamentary approval. And that seems to be going backwards in what we're trying to do here.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. McCauley. What we've learned in looking at other jurisdictions is that they do introduce what we call purpose-based votes so that parliamentarians have a better sense of how the resources are supporting specific programs. In doing that, in moving from a single operating vote in a department to 3, 4, or 5 purpose-based votes, you're necessarily...
But do you think the answer is just giving them, here's a higher amount of money without any oversight?
It's not a question of oversight.
Or without parliamentary approval to move it around?
So, for instance, in Quebec, what they do with their supply bill is they have purpose-based votes, but the supply bill allows departments to transfer up to 10% of funds between votes, and it's not done without full reporting by department, so there is transparency in the reporting. Other jurisdictions introduce either multi-year appropriations or enhanced carry forwards.
I just want to quote you. It says the balance could be achieved by establishing votes at a relatively high level, not a moderate, but a relatively high, and then allowing organizations to move monies without additional approval of Parliament. So again, it seems to be the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. We're going to give relatively high amount of money and then take away any ability for Parliament to approve.
If I may, Kelly, what we have now is within a department, you can move money around without really any...
So Pillar 3 doesn't seem to be helping that, though.
No, it is a step, and if you look at the work done at Transport in terms of the pilot, again, when funding is approved by Parliament for a specific program, the ability for within a ministry to move it from there to somewhere else, you can have up to 10%, which provides, particularly to avoid lapsing in a particular area, if it makes sense. But it's significantly improved over what exists now, and in moving in that direction.
So it's a step and not a...
It's a step, but all improvement begins with a step, and to then see how does it work, and then say, can we move further? And I'm open to that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Monsieur Ayoub, 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, and thank you to all of you for being here. I have a more technical question for the Treasury Board Secretariat. There is a pilot project with Transport Canada. This pilot project should have yielded results by now. I'd like to know more about this pilot project. What were the results? What were the advantages and inconveniences, the disadvantages, and how would this pilot project help you plan for better change in the future? Thank you very much for the question. The pilot project at Transport Canada represented an opportunity for us to consider whether that approach would be right for other departments. The results were actually positive, and perhaps Brian can describe it to you in more detail, and he can tell you what we learned so far and what lessons could be applied in the future. Thank you very much for the question. In 2015-2016, the Department of Transportation received around $600 million, a vote for $600 million, and we are working with the department on the pilot project. We are piloting it or testing it. This vote would apply for gateways and corridors and transportation and infrastructure and another project. So we would disaggregate the vote. And this would be a way to give Parliament a better idea of how the money was spent on certain programs. Now, clearly, the fiscal year is not over yet, so we do not have the final results at this point. But based on what we've seen so far, the department's the pilot project worked well for the department, and it allowed us to better appreciate how the money was spent. So do I understand correctly that the Department of Transportation was able to absorb the change and to give back results, and to do so in a parallel manner, because I imagine that they're still going on with the old system and they're using the new one? Am I wrong on that point? No, that's right, actually. So this is an example of a huge vote, $600 million, and this project has shown us that in future a department can disaggregate results, that is, present different results for different votes. For instance, we have the Gateway project, which has certain results, and the other projects have other results. So this gives us a more specific view of how the money was spent. In terms of preparation and training of employees, were they given special training for this pilot project? So how long did the training take place to allow employees to actually implement the pilot project? So the origin of the pilot project is the report which was produced by this committee several years ago. So we worked with the department to develop the pilot project. No specific training was given. It was simply a matter of identifying best practices and to work with the department to show the benefits of that approach, to look towards the future, to project towards the future. Did you make any financial forecasts under this project, and how these forecasts would apply to other departments in the interest of being more transparent and more efficient? And if you did that cost anything? And does the pilot project give us the information on those costs? Well, again, this pilot project was rolled out in one department only, and the next step would be to scale up or expand this pilot project elsewhere. And into operational votes. And we will then assess the costs and benefits of that approach. There is another advantage to that approach because we will be able to apply it in other departments. And one of these advantages is that Parliament will be able to better measure results. It will be able to consider the objectives of the program and measure the results of the program. This in and of itself is a significant change when it comes to how effectively government can oversee these projects.
Mr. Minister, for sticking around. I want to return to the theme of effective...
I thought I was going to get free lunch or something.
Well, you might. So to return to the theme of effective opposition, I was just wondering whether you could clarify if the proposed reforms would change the number of supply days in the House?
I don't have the answer to that, Mr. Weir. Now, if my colleagues here, I want to have the number of the impact on supply, the number of supply days. What would I don't know, but I'll get back to you.
Okay, so you can't provide any assurance that the number of supply days would not be reduced as a result of these changes?
Do you have some? We'll get you an
right.
exact answer.
I can tell you, Mr. Weir, there is no intention to impact that in any way. The number of supply periods would remain the same, and supply days are negotiated by the government in opposition. We have no, there's no correlation between.
Well, yeah, certainly.
I don't see what why there would be an impact, but I just want to make sure of that.
Yeah, okay, if you can come back maybe just a little more concretely
if anything,
on that, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And but beyond that, the objective here is to improve committee scrutiny of the government in terms of expenditures.
Well, we appreciate that. And in terms of those expenditures, the majority of estimates for most departments would be to pay those departments' employees. This committee's been looking at the Phoenix payroll system. I appreciate you're not the minister directly responsible, but the Treasury Board does provide the employer function for the federal government. We've been told that the backlog in Phoenix will be cleared up by the end of October, which is a week away. I'm just wondering if you and Treasury Board have confidence that that will happen and the government will be properly paying its employees by the end of the month.
I believe that actually last week the Deputy Minister at Public Service and Procurement Canada did an update on that and a briefing on that and addressed this situation. We as the employer at Treasury Board, we work closely with Public Service and Procurement Canada where the Phoenix system is housed. It is absolutely fundamental to the employee relationship that people are paid on time and accurately. We're fixing this. I know my colleague Minister Foote, her deputy Marie Lemay.
And fixing it by October 31st?
There was an update on that last week by the Deputy Minister at Public Service and Procurement in Canada on this that described where it's at now. There have been a lot of additional resources applied in terms of people being brought in to address this. It's a lesson to government, both our government and the previous government. It's a lesson to any government. When you're doing enterprise-wide IT transformation, whether you're in a government or a business, it is very complex. It is fraught with challenges, and it's not a reason not to do these things. The pay system needed to be modernized, but we would do things differently if given the opportunity. This was introduced by the previous government. We were brought in at a particular point in time. There are lessons to be learned from the implementation of the Phoenix pay system that would mean any government in the future would do it differently.
Sir, once again, thank you for coming here today and spending a little bit more time than you originally budgeted for. And to committee, I mean, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again for the record, I think this is an extremely, extremely important study that we're about to commence for no other reason than this. And again, going back for my 12 years experience here, if we can get this right, and I think we're on the right, I think, Minister, you are on the right track, it would finally, and I mean finally after generations, give the responsibility and the authority for the expenditures of monies away from the public service and into the hands of the parliamentarians. And as far as I was concerned, when I was first elected, that's what we were here to do. So once again, thank you for your efforts, and we will hopefully see you once again. You said you've made about 12 appearances. Hopefully you wouldn't mind making a baker's dozen if we invite you back here again sometime in the near future. Thanks once again. We are adjourned.
Thank you very much.
Colleagues, if I may, since we only have this room until 1 o'clock, the remainder of this meeting, questions and answers, will be somewhat truncated. Mr. Pagan, I believe you've got about 5 minutes more in a presentation. You have a few more slides. And then we'll, colleagues, go into, I think, one round of 7-minute interventions. So we'll get every party involved, but by then should be close to 1 o'clock. So, Mr. Pagan, without any further ado, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As presented, this is a four-pillar approach to estimates reform. We've just spent some time talking about the very critical element of timing. In about 5 minutes, I'll quickly walk you through the three remaining pillars. Once we can fix the timing of the estimates, there are other sources of incoherence and coordination that must be addressed. And these include the scope and accounting, the nature of control, and reporting. Pillar 2 is about scope and accounting, or what we refer to as the universe of the estimates. The problem, Mr. Chair, is quite simple. The budget presents a complete and full picture of the totality of government spending, including Crown corporations, consolidated accounts such as employment insurance, programs through the tax system such as the Canada Child Benefit. In contrast, the estimates are simply a more narrow subset of government spending, and they're focused on the expenditures that must be authorized through an appropriation. So that is the universe, and then of course we have accounting differences. The budget is on an accrual basis, the estimates are on a cash. The problem has I think, been oversimplified by talking about cash and accrual, and it's much broader than that. What we see in slide 8 is the benefits of reconciling these accounting and universe challenges if we can table the main estimates after the budget. And the President mentioned our interest in deepening the reconciliation between the two documents. The federal budget last year presented an expense forecast of $317.1 billion. Supplementary Estimates A provided authority to spend $251.4 billion. That's a $65.7 billion gap. The universe accounts for about $60 billion of that, and that is to say consolidated specified purpose accounts such as employment insurance, expenditures through the tax system such as the Canada Child Benefit, and then other expenses of government such as consolidated Crown corporations. So that's about $60 billion. The actual accounting difference, the difference between accrual and cash, represents about $4.8 billion. And this difference is explained by things like capital amortization, bad debt allowances, and interest on future obligations. And then finally, to complete the reconciliation, there would be items that are in the budget but have not yet been brought forward for approval. And as we saw in Subs A last year, that was about $4.9 billion. So this is an example of how, if we can table the estimates after the budget, we would be able to provide a reconciliation to the budget and thus eliminate some of the confusion and frustration that parliamentarians and committees experience. Quickly, in terms of vote structure, and we did touch on this in the previous round, the objective here is to improve Parliament's line of sight on program costs and results. We are currently doing a pilot project with Transport Canada for their grants and contributions vote. The idea would be to expand that across all departmental operations and provide committees with a better line of sight relationship between resources and programs. For example, the Treasury Board Secretariat, where we, as mentioned by the President, we're the employer, we're the expenditure authority, we're the regulatory authority. Perhaps rather than having a single operating vote, we might want to experiment with votes related to each of those core responsibilities. Mr. McCauley, that's what we mean by that high level related to our core responsibilities. And we could do that for any other department. Global Affairs, for instance, has a single operating vote, but we know that they have responsibilities for development, diplomacy, and trade. We can disaggregate that at almost any level, but of course there are costs and challenges. There are some jurisdictions that have as many as 12,000 votes. I would argue that they're not the best run jurisdictions, but that's something that we could study and work with the committee. And then finally, our last pillar around results and reporting, as was mentioned in the introduction, we do have a new Treasury Board results policy. It came into effect the 1st of July. We are working with a handful of departments now to operationalize this and to present new departmental results frameworks and new reports to Parliament that we would see in the spring cycle. And this policy will be fully operational by all departments by this time next year, by November 2017. Before I conclude, just a word, a plug, if you will, for TBS Infobase. As was again mentioned in the introduction, in 2012 the committee recommended the creation of an accessible online database. We've made great strides, Mr. Chair, in making this a reality, and I would commend, if members are not familiar with Infobase, I would commend this to them as a way of facilitating an awareness and study of departmental operations. The graphic here is simply a snapshot of the types of information that are available through Infobase that include all kinds of indicators around actual costs, projected costs, FTE utilization, the distribution of FTEs across the country, demographic information, etc. And as the Minister mentioned, we have plans moving forward to deepen this and enrich the information available to committees. En conclusion, pour aller de l'avant, il y a encore.
Now, we still have many complex issues which need to be dealt with regard to the accounting framework and the votes in the estimates. These significant changes mean that we will have to change the way the department operates and publishes its information. We are proposing to proceed in small stages before we move to the bigger ones. So before actually beginning, we are proposing to change the deadline for tabling the estimates, and as that change becomes integrated in the process, we would work with the committee to develop options for other changes.
Presentation, and I would be very happy, myself and Madame Santiago, to respond to additional questions.
Thank you very much, and we'll start that line of questioning with Mr. Grewal. 7 minutes, please.
Chair, and thank you, sir, for coming today to share your testimony. Coming from the private sector as a former corporate lawyer and a financial analyst, it's it was really surprising that the budget and the estimates process is done like this in government. It just basically makes no sense, in my humble opinion. But my concern is that we're looking at other models. We're looking at the Australian model. We're looking at the UK model. Are we prepared once this thing, as we implement the changes, for this not to fall apart in the interim period? And what are we? Can you please give some color to how we're going to make sure that everything is accounted for in the transition period?
Right. Well, thank you, Mr. Grewal. I mean, you're absolutely right. The current process does not make much sense. It's very difficult to explain, and as the President said, it's easier to describe what we want to do than how we're currently doing business. And that's very much the reason that we propose a four-pillar approach, get the timing right, and in getting the timing right, bring greater clarity on some of the other interests and needs of committees, including accounting and universe and the control structure through the vote framework. If we can proceed in an orderly fashion in that way, then yes, I do believe that we are lined up to succeed. The change of standing orders is the prerogative of the House, but we understand it to be a fairly simple and straightforward question of simply changing on or before 1st of March to on or before the 1st of May. And we are working very closely with the Department of Finance to deepen the coordination of the budget and TB approvals. Last year's success in bringing forward almost 70% of the budget in our supplementary estimates A, which were tabled on the 10th of May, suggests that we can succeed here in bringing forward budget items into the main estimates tabled on or before the 1st of May.
Thank you. And my next question is, from a planning perspective, how much will the government and MPs benefit from the changes that we're about to implement?
It's really a question of coherence and comprehension. Tabling main estimates last year in advance of the budget, and everyone knew that there was an important budget coming because of the platform commitments around infrastructure and environment and Aboriginals, made absolutely no sense. So we put in front of Parliament a document that was of very little utility to committees. And then we had to race to work very, very hard to bring forward those budget items in the supplementary estimates. By changing the process so that the estimates are presented after the budget, we are presenting a much more coherent picture to parliamentarians and rendering their study of the estimates, I believe, much more fruitful and useful. And I would make the point that we would also be simplifying processes so that in that June supply period, you would have a single supply bill for main estimates, as opposed to now where we have full supply for main estimates and supplementary estimates. It's somewhat confusing to have two appropriation acts presented on the same day. And then we would focus the supply periods in December and March on what would then become Subs A and Subs B. So thereby, committees would be engaged throughout the year in a continuous study of estimates. And as the Minister said, there is a commitment, if departments table estimates, ministers will appear and speak to and explain their estimate requirements.
How much is the transition going to cost internally?
Well, in terms of timing, we believe that costs are negligible. It's simply a question of better sequencing the work in departments. In fact, there's by not having to produce a spring SUPS, which basically duplicates the main estimates, there would be very, very minor savings of some efforts.
Thank you. I think my colleague had a question to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and hello. I'd like to hear you more on transparency. June 14th, 2016, Treasury Board officials said that they would be working on helping parliamentarians understand the entire estimates and budget process. So what is the federal government doing to optimize the transparency of its finances? How can we improve that aspect? Thank you very much for the question. Well, the first step is to make the system much more simple, much more understandable for this committee. Right now, there's so much overlap between the estimates and the supplementary estimates. And because of that, the process is much more complex than is necessary or ideally. Minister Bryson also said that it was important to focus more on results and to better align or present resources and the results which were obtained. We can move forward with new policies, but also with votes which will be purpose-driven. Those are two examples of how we can make the process more understandable. There's also the matter of timing. And aligning votes based on the purpose of each program. If I may, a quick supplementary. What should the role be of the Parliamentary Budget Officer to improve transparency and accountability of the government in terms of its finances? I think the role of the Parliamentary Budget Officer is very clear. It's to work with MPs and committees to make the process more understandable, more user-friendly, to study issues raised by members of Parliament. Since last year, I'd say that we've worked fairly closely with the Parliamentary Budget Officer at identifying issues and the needs of members of Parliament, and on how we can move forward with our agendas. I would also like to point out that the Parliamentary Budget Officer did point to some improvements which we've made. For instance, the supplementary estimates C included a schedule which helped to understand the gap. He said that in doing so, we made it easier for members of Parliament to be at the same level of understanding as executives. Thank you, Mr. Clark. 7 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both of you, and thanks for still being with us. Mr. Pagan, the budget cycle as it currently exists in Australia, which is the model Canada is looking at, since when has the system been in effect in Australia? Has it always been like that, or is that something more recent? Thank you for the question. Well, you're right. We are turning towards the Australian model, but not just Australia. Quebec and Ontario also have fairly comparable processes, comparable to Australia's. In Australia, I think their system goes back to 2006. And it's more or less the same timeline for Ontario. Do you know whether in Quebec, Ontario, or Australia, whether there was a period of adjustment as we were talking about for the federal government? Well, especially as regards the accounting system and the cash accounting system versus the accrual system. So in terms of tabling the estimates and the budget at the same time, that didn't actually involve any major complications, as the President said. There was no problem when it came to training people to bring that about. Now, when it comes to the accounting systems, well, that's a different kettle of fish. The accrual accounting system is very complex, much more complex than the cash accounting system. And training has to be given if to managers, and also to ensure that MPs better understand the different accounting systems. If I may, in Ontario and in Australia, after the cash accounting system was brought about, there were some problems in several jurisdictions when it came to oversight in departments.
In common parlance, they blew their votes. Et c'était relié au problème de formation et de...
And that was due to training, because that type of accounting system was really complex. Well, thank you for everything you've just said, but I just want a really specific answer. In Australia, as of the first year, was the budget tabled at the same time as the estimates? Yes. It also says here that...
Mais donc, est-ce que vous prévoyez qu'il y a...
If that's the case, do you believe that there will be a cap on transfers between programs? Well, that's something we need to look at, something the committee needs to look at, and departments as well. In Ontario, for instance, there are appropriations depending on the program. And under their Appropriations Act, they can transfer amounts between departments without needing legislative approval. In Quebec, there is a cap on the transfers. It's capped at 10% of votes. So it's a matter of understanding the limits of any flexibility built into each department. And it's a matter of identifying how we can ensure transparency while also allowing a certain degree of flexibility so programs and services can be delivered. You don't have any specific numbers in your document here, such as 10%. Are you thinking of imposing a cap at the federal level? Well, we're not putting any specific cap forward. It's something to look at down the road. And we would like to work with the committee and the departments to identify the best approach. Thank you. A little further it says, but one of our concerns on this side of the committee is that this flexibility could be used
and also to move money around in a less transparent way. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de ça?
What do you think of that? Well, it's a good question. For us, it's a matter of really understanding, or rather of aligning resources with programs. I mentioned a little earlier that at Global Affairs Canada, as it now stands, they have an operational threshold. In future, it's possible that under a different approach, there might be specific votes for development programs, specific votes for diplomacy or other programs, and that's an example of purpose-based programs. The more votes there are, the more complex it is for the department. And this comes with a greater likelihood of lapses, because the department will not have the flexibility to transfer amounts between programs. So we want to look at finding an approach that strikes a balance between transparency and flexibility. Thank you.
Presenting the estimates by May 1st, there would still be a need for interim supply for departments during the initial months of the fiscal year. And I'm wondering if you could give us a sense of how that would work under the proposed reforms.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Weir. In fact, in the discussion paper, there is an annex which presents an illustration of what interim estimates could look like. We would envision it being very much similar to the present case, where we would present main estimates, interim estimates on or before the 1st of March. However, these would be based on a continuation of the current year authorities rather than the future year, because we don't know future year yet because of the budget. In our mind, this would have the advantage of avoiding some situations that we've seen in the past. This committee may remember the case of Marine Atlantic in 2015-16, where continuation of certain funding was contingent on a budget decision. Because the main estimates were presented before the budget, there was a fairly significant decrease in the main estimates for Marine Atlantic that year. It was assumed to be some sort of cut, and in fact it wasn't a cut. It was simply the fact that the continuation of the funding was ad ref the budget. And so by presenting an interim estimates that would be based on a continuation of existing authorities, there would be no reductions unless those reductions were announced in the budget. And the interim main estimates would continue to be based on a fraction. We talk about twelfths. Interim supply is usually 3/12 of a department's overall requirements. That would continue to be the basis of interim supply, but we would work with departments where they could identify specific needs very early in the year. They would get incremental fractions to reflect that authority. For instance, grants and contributions that are made to Aboriginal bands right at the beginning of the year. would justify a higher increment.
Okay, I mean, that was one of the points I wanted to hit on. It does strike me that one of the potential pitfalls of basing interim supply on the current year is you might have departments that actually need to spend more money for a legitimate reason right near the start of the fiscal year. So I guess you're acknowledging there'd have to be some kind of special allowance for that.
Absolutely, yeah. And I believe the interim document does present that possibility.
Okay, excellent. I guess another question just about the kind of overall system and the reforms proposed. Currently, Treasury Board doesn't really get involved until after the budget is tabled. Would you envision or should our committee be considering the possibility of Treasury Board getting involved in the budget making process at an earlier stage?
Well, thank you, Mr. Rear, for the question. That's in fact at the heart of the issue of timing and our recommendation for a May 1st tabling of main estimates. The development of the budget is the responsibility and prerogative of the Minister of Finance, and so we have to be very mindful of that responsibility. At the same time, for a number of years now, we have worked very closely with the Department of Finance in advance of the tabling of the budget to get a sense of those initiatives that are likely to be supported so that we can begin working with departments to pre-position Treasury Board submissions and proposals to Treasury Board ministers for their approval. And as the Minister was saying, we intend on deepening that relationship so that we can work ever more closely and lessen the gap between the budget and presentation of main estimates.
Okay. Now, we've had a fair bit of discussion about the Department of Transport as an example, and it just reminds me to follow up with you about something that I asked you and the Minister about at a previous meeting. This is the Global Transportation Hub, which is a Crown corporation in Saskatchewan that receives significant federal money. It also spent millions of dollars buying land at grossly inflated prices from businessmen with close connections to the governing Sask party. Now, the response to this initially was that you and the Minister would look into it. The response subsequently was that it had been referred to the Provincial Auditor General. The Provincial Auditor General has now reported and confirms that there is vast overspending on this land. So I just wonder, in this work that Treasury Board's been doing with the Department of Transport, has there been any recourse with the federal money that's tied up in that project?
Thank you, Mr. Weir. I'm not familiar with recent reports from the Auditor General or any response from the department, and we would have to go back and look at that.
Okay, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, the Provincial Auditor General has reported, so I'd be very interested to know the federal government's stance regarding the millions of dollars that it's put into the Global Transportation Hub. If you can come back to us at a later date on that, it would be greatly appreciated.
Pleasure.
Okay, so Mr. Pagan, it struck me that there was some information you were maybe hoping to present about budget timing that you hadn't quite had a chance to do due to time constraints earlier. If you'd like to take a minute for that, you'd be most welcome.
Right, well thank you. I mentioned that over the last 10 years, budgets have been presented as early as the end of January or as late as the 21st of April, and there are good and valid reasons why. In 2009, global economic crisis, it was very important for the government to send signals to Canadians and the Canadian marketplace about its ability to invest and support employment and the functioning of credit markets. So that is an example of the government acting early. More recently in 2015, with the dramatic drop in the energy market, there was some confusion as to whether this was a temporary dip and was going to rebound quickly, or if it was a more permanent feature that would impact underlying economic environment, capital investment, employment levels, et cetera. And so in that year, the government actually delayed the budget, looking for the best information possible before presenting its plans. So those two extremes, if you will, point to the benefits of some flexibility in the tabling of budgets. Our proposal of May 1st would allow for, would accommodate either scenario, and would present the main estimates after the budget, which would render the documents more coherent and reconcilable.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have no one else on my list unless there's certainly.
Confused. You know, when there was a question asked to you about the ability of parliamentarians to study. At the moment, we study the main estimates, and then we really don't study the budget, but we study the main estimates, and sometimes those main estimates are not in line with the budget. So help me understand that if you align it, how much time will parliamentarians have to study what the government is actually spending?
Right. Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Tani. The issue of the first pillar of timing is very important, I believe, to all of us, because it would present a main estimates, or at least the possibility of a main estimates document that is more useful, more reconciled to the budget. That in itself is a benefit. Nothing about the proposal is meant in any way to diminish the number of supply days or the ability of committees to examine the estimates on an ongoing basis. There would continue to be 3 supply periods. We would be presenting estimates documents in each of the supply periods, and therefore committees would have the ability to call witnesses and hear from ministers and staff about not only the main estimates, but the ongoing operations of departments. Bob Marlow, who the minister mentioned in the introduction, has underlined the fact that that committees should be encouraged to look at the estimates on an ongoing basis rather than just episodically in the spring. And we would support that.
Ms. Santiago, thank you so much for your appearance here again today. And committee members, I remind you, we are back in this room, I believe the same room at 3:30 this afternoon for our continuing study on Canada Post. We are adjourned.